History as it happens, April 5th, 2022. A peace plan for Ukraine.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says Russia is committing genocide.
Ukraine says it has liberated the area surrounding Kyiv as Russia's forces.
Russia wants Ukraine to abandon its ambitions of joining NATO.
Russia has verbally accepted all of Ukraine's positions except on Crimea.
This guy is brutal, and what's happening in Bucha is outrageous, and everyone's seen it.
It may take realism, not idealism, to end the war, which seems to be heading into a new, uncertain phase, as the world recoils at the images of massacred civilians in a suburb of Kyiv, leading President Biden to call for a war crimes trial against Vladimir Putin. To avoid a prolonged war, history provides some examples of what a treaty might look like. That's next, as we report history as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
Here in Bucharest, we must make clear that NATO welcomes the aspirations of Georgia and Ukraine for their membership in NATO.
The Ukrainians have offered something which they couldn't offer before the war, but we should have offered, which is a treaty of neutrality. Because, of course, as President Zelensky has said, NATO repeatedly refused not merely to take Ukraine into NATO, but to make any firm offer of NATO membership in the foreseeable future.
Picture a Russian leader paranoid about his nation being encircled by the West. He wants to dominate his weaker neighbors to create a buffer or a sphere of influence. The leader then orders his armies to invade one of those neighbors with the aim of installing a puppet regime, but instead the invaders meet ferocious resistance, and the defenders win overwhelming world opinion to their side. I could be talking about what's happening today in Eastern Europe, but I'm actually describing the Winter War of 1939-1940, when Stalin ordered the Red Army to invade Finland, which, like Ukraine today, won the support of much of the Western world because it was a victim in a Soviet war of aggression, as this American propaganda film made clear.
War has gripped Europe, a war of oppression, striking terror to the hearts of innocent millions. Tiny Finland is the latest victim of this unprovoked and ruthless aggression, and its peaceful cities and countryside are soon laid waste by the ravages.
The Soviet advantage in men and firepower eventually wore down the Finnish defenses. A treaty was signed ending the war, ceding Finnish territory to the USSR. But as our guest points out, the Finns convinced Stalin that it would be far too difficult to impose a communist government on Finland. And after the Second World War in 1948, the two nations reached an agreement by which Finland would remain neutral, meaning it did not join NATO or the Warsaw Pact.
And I think that the Ukrainians have actually already done the same, because it's pretty clear Putin and his immediate advisors, their move on Kiev was intended either to terrify the Ukrainian government into immediate submission, or to replace it.
My conversation with Anatol Lieven of the Quincy Institute is coming up in a moment. We're also going to look at 1955 and the Austrian State Treaty. It ended the post-war occupation of a country that Hitler had annexed in 1938. Austria would remain neutral throughout the Cold War. Ukraine is now said to be willing to forego NATO membership as part of a possible peace settlement with Russia, a membership that was vaguely promised in 2008 at the Bucharest conference, where President Bush's remarks further damaged relations with Moscow without ever bringing Ukraine into the alliance.
Here in Bucharest, we must make clear that NATO welcomes the aspirations of Georgia and Ukraine for their membership in NATO and offers them a clear path forward to meet that goal. So my country's position is clear. NATO should welcome Georgia and Ukraine into the membership action plan.
Dealing with the NATO question is, of course, just one obstacle here. There are now calls for a war crimes investigation after civilians were massacred in the Kyiv suburb of Bucha. Russian forces remain powerful in the eastern and southern stretches of Ukraine. And the idea that Ukraine would have to effectively cede some of its territory to Russia in order to end the war, well, barring massive military intervention by the West, how could Ukraine expel the invaders from the Donbass? The alternative to peace is, of course, more war. With the possibility of escalation, Russia seems to have given up on seizing Kyiv for now, but the war is only 6 weeks old, and what appears to be a stalemate today could change. Anatol Lieven is a senior research fellow on Russia and Europe at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, and he's been arguing in favor of a treaty of neutrality to end the war. Anatol Lieven, welcome back.
Hello, nice to be back.
Before I start picking your brain about these difficult issues, I'd like to know, how busy have you been? Pretty busy, huh?
Pretty busy. I mean, between trying to follow the news on the ground and trying to analyze it and trying to make recommendations, pretty busy.
Yeah, you can sense the sarcasm in my question. I see you all over the place. Everyone wants to talk to you, so thank you for taking time to speak to us. What is the Anatol Lieven peace plan for Ukraine?
Well, it's the Ukrainian plan, basically, but with one or two fairly major qualifications. The Ukrainians have offered something which they couldn't offer before the war, but we should have offered, which is a treaty of neutrality. Because, of course, as President Zelensky has said, NATO repeatedly refused not merely to take Ukraine into NATO, but to make any firm offer of NATO membership in the foreseeable future. Today, something which I must say caused a bitter laugh from me, the British Deputy Prime Minister has said that Britain will not guarantee any Ukrainian neutrality, will not guarantee Ukrainian security, because Ukraine is not a member of NATO, and therefore Britain has no obligation to do so. Well, now, that may be true, but after all this talk, of solidarity with Ukraine and support for Ukraine and all this pretense at Western and especially British toughness, I found that pretty hard to take, I must say. So a treaty of neutrality is pretty obvious.
What do you mean by neutrality?
Well, it is that Ukraine cannot join NATO or any other military alliance, but also, of course, cannot join a Russian-led security alliance. So people sometimes forget that. I mean, Putin's hopes, at least before 2014, but probably this year as well, of turning Ukraine into a Russian military satellite also are banned by that. And, there are historical precedents. There's the Finnish-Soviet Treaty. There is the Austrian State Treaty of 1955, by which Soviet, American, British occupying troops left Austria. And the Austrian State Treaty was accompanied by international guarantees of Austrian sovereignty, territorial integrity. Now, the Ukrainians are asking for firm security guarantees, not just from NATO, but also from all the members of the United Nations Security Council, to go to war to defend Ukraine if Russia attacks again. They're not going to get that because, obviously, countries are not going to commit themselves to go to war with Russia. But if they're prepared to drop that, I think they will get a very strongly worded set of commitments to Ukrainian security. Also, I mean, what I think they certainly will get, certainly should get, would be the automatic resumption of full Western sanctions on Russia if there were further aggression. But to be honest, I think that the greatest Ukrainian security against future Russian aggression, if there can be a peace settlement and Russian withdrawal from most of the new areas they've occupied, is simply that the Russians have been given such a bloody nose. And it is so obvious that the original Russian plan failed. They have taken such heavy casualties and frankly suffered such military humiliation in some areas that I think it's extremely unlikely that any Russian government would try this again if you do get a peace settlement that meets basic Russian concerns.
One would hope. You mentioned the comment before by the British official that Britain would not be willing to guarantee, through the use of force, Ukraine's sovereignty. So how would a neutrality pact be enforced?
It would be enforced by sanctions and, as I say, by the proven Ukrainian willingness to resist, backed up by a strong, very well-equipped Ukrainian army. No treaty can ever be completely guaranteed. That's just not in the nature of international relations.
That is true. You mentioned the Soviet-Finnish War. I'd like to touch on that as a historical precedent for our listeners who may not be familiar with that chapter in history. This is 1940. This is during the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact period. Where Stalin and Hitler agree not to attack each other, really a treaty of expediency. They agree to carve up Poland. It gave the Soviet Union time to absorb other countries, so Stalin invades Finland, hoping to impose a communist government on the Finns, and the much smaller Finnish army is able to fend off a huge Soviet onslaught.
Yes, I mean, that's correct. Now, of course, the Finns were eventually defeated, and they had to sacrifice a fair amount of territory to the Soviet Union. But on the other hand, it does seem that the strength of the Finnish resistance convinced Stalin that taking Finland into the Soviet Union would simply be more trouble than it was worth. And so even though after that, in 1941, understandably enough, the Finns joined Hitler's Germany in attacking the Soviet Union, when they made peace in 1944, they had to sign a treaty of neutrality with the Soviet Union, but they were the only part of the former Russian Empire, as it existed until 1917, that was not incorporated by Lenin or Stalin in the Soviet Union. So Finnish resistance really achieved something. And I think that the Ukrainians have actually already done the same. Because it's pretty clear Putin and his immediate advisors, their move on Kiev was intended either to terrify the Ukrainian government into immediate submission or to replace it. And it is, of course, possible that if Zelensky had run away, as apparently America offered to him, that they'd fly him out of the country, and he extremely bravely and honorably refused. It is, of course, possible that if Zelensky had run away, then Ukrainian resistance might have collapsed, at least in certain areas. Obviously, that plan totally failed. The Russians have been fought to a standstill outside Kiev and Kharkov and Mykolaiv. So the original plan to subjugate the whole of Ukraine and to turn the government into a client government has failed. I think we need to recognize that very clearly, because it does mean that the maximal Russian objective has already been defeated.
It's true. Ukraine has established some facts on the ground from which they can negotiate. But that is for now. Some of my recent guests, military historians such as Max Hastings, have said they're not too optimistic if the war drags on that Ukraine will be able to hold off the Russian onslaught. So my question to you, Anatol, is part of formulating a peace plan depends on being able to discern Russia's war aims. I think you're correct. The initial assault on Kyiv failed. What is Russia trying to accomplish now? Going in a different direction? Will they return to Kyiv? Do we know? Is it possible to know?
In the longer run, it's impossible to say for sure. But in the shorter term, we do know, because they've actually announced it themselves, with some cover of this being to contribute to peace and so forth. But they've said that they will basically suspend their attacks around Kiev in order to concentrate on, in their words, not mine, liberating the Donbass region. Because one of the really striking things about the Russian failure to date is that up to the beginning of the war, the separatist republics of the Donbass only possessed or controlled a portion of the territory of that region, the official administrative territory as it existed. The rest of it was held by the Ukrainians. And now, in more than 5 weeks of war, the Russians have still not managed to occupy the whole of the Donbass. Mariupol is still holding out just, and most of the rest of the territory is still in Ukrainian hands. Well, now, I think you see that it is absolutely essential for Putin to be able to present this to the Russian people as some kind of victory, that the Russians at least occupy the whole of the Donbass. Having done that, two things are open to them. One would be to continue the war to conquer more of Ukraine. But it seems to me that there's also a possibility, given just how heavily the Russians have suffered. The news today, Putin is calling up another 130,000 Russian conscripts. That's not going to be popular with their families in Russia. The Ukrainians have alleged that 8 Russian generals have been killed. Now, I think we can believe that because the Russians have not produced the generals, which they certainly would have done if they were still walking around, to show the Ukrainians were lying. Now, that indicates two things. It indicates really heavy Russian casualties, and it indicates low levels of morale. Generals in modern warfare only lead from the front in that way if they really need to inspire their men. What's particularly striking about both these things is that the Russians obviously use their elite units. We know the units, they're supposed to be crack Russian units, in their initial assault. Well, if they have both suffered heavy casualties and are suffering from real problems of morale, then Russian conscript troops will suffer even more. So I think the Russian military campaign is in serious trouble. What they can do, though, is to occupy the whole of the Donbass, and the land bridge and the Black Sea coast between Crimea and the Donbass, and then offer a peace settlement to the Ukrainians while basically going on to the defensive. Because then, of course, the Ukrainians would have to attack dug-in Russian positions, at which point Russian artillery would start to exert, and this would be across open country. Ukrainian successes have been mostly in urban areas. Ukraine would then face an endless slogging match with no certain result. That's also a very possible Russian future strategy.
Let's remember that since 2014, there's been a war, a low-level civil war, a separatist war in the Donbass that has killed something like 15,000 people. So there's another parallel to the past here, the Soviet-Finnish War, or the Winter War as it's known, the utter ineptitude of the Russian offensive. Now, it may take some time, may take years to fully figure out what happened, but I think we can draw some conclusions right now that this has gone terribly. Antony Beaver, military historian, told me the Russians didn't have enough infantry to accompany their tanks. They haven't established air supremacy. I'm no military analyst, but it's pretty obvious that they screwed up.
Absolutely. Much of it stemmed from the original Sun Tzu said, know your enemy. Putin received appallingly bad intelligence about the Ukrainian will to fight, to resist. As I have to say, the Bush administration before the Iraq War, but obviously much, much worse. It does look very much as if Putin has become completely isolated from any advice that goes against his own prejudices and decisions. They had far too few troops. Ukraine is a country of 230,000 square miles. The Russians attacked from 6 different directions and used half of their troops in a move on Kiev. It's not surprising, therefore, that elsewhere they were fought to a halt. Of course, also, they appear totally not to have factored in the possibility, which I raised before the war, not with them, of course, but in public, and as did others, that the Ukrainians would do what the Chechens did in 1994 and 1999, which is retreat into the cities and fight it out street by street. As America knows from some melancholy historical examples, that makes life very difficult for the attacking troops. It also, of course, leads to horrendous destruction and civilian casualties, which we've also seen.
And Putin, who laments the end of the Soviet Union, he rues that day, right, when the Soviet Union collapsed, should have known from his own country's history. Afghanistan and Ukraine are much different geographically, topographically, right? But still, the Soviet Union got bogged down in a war that it thought it could win very easily. But we know, Anatol, that when wars begin, logic can go out the window and the sunken cost fallacy, right? Instead of facing the reality that the war cannot be won on your terms, you continue to escalate it because you've already lost X number of people and spent this much money, and leaders, whether they're Democrats or autocrats, don't like to admit defeat.
Yeah, absolutely. And Putin now really badly needs something that can be presented as a victory, even if, objectively speaking, this war has been and will be a disaster for Russia. But, from his point of view, he just needs something that he can show on Russian television as if it was a success.
Yeah. Let's go back to your peace plan, or a peace plan. Help me understand something. So if Crimea were to remain in Russian hands, and we know that the United States did not recognize the 2014 annexation, and if the Donbass were to become, a quasi-independent state within a sovereign Ukraine, how would this work? I guess my question is, how might Ukraine be able to consider itself under a neutrality pact, a fully sovereign and independent nation, if parts of its territory are either controlled directly, like Crimea, or de facto part of Russia, the Donbass?
Well, there are some international precedents for this, rather depressing ones, but still. The case of Cyprus is an interesting one. Turkey invaded Cyprus in 1974, split off northern Cyprus as a Turkic republic, didn't annex it, but has defended it ever since. Nobody else in the world recognizes northern Cyprus internationally. But since then, there have been endless rounds of negotiation about trying to reunite them in some kind of confederation or common state. And strikingly enough, this did not prevent southern Cyprus or the Republic of Cyprus from joining the European Union, although there was this continued territorial dispute. So what the Ukrainians have proposed very sensibly is that this issue simply be deferred for diplomatic negotiation, and that in the meantime, both sides promise not to use force. And the Ukrainians have also said that they will end their blockade of Crimea's water, which they were engaged in before the war, which was doing a lot of damage to Crimea. At that point, the rest of the world continues to recognize that Crimea is part of Ukraine. Ukraine, of course, claims sovereignty. And we just engage in endless rounds of negotiation. It seems to me that that is the only way out now, because it's simply not possible, militarily speaking, for Ukraine to reconquer Crimea. Now, the Donbass is more difficult because, as I say, the problem is that the Russians haven't even conquered the whole of the Donbass. And it would be terribly difficult for the Ukrainians to agree to shelve not merely the issue of the separatist republics as they existed until the Russian invasion, which the Ukrainians, by the way, are willing to do. They've also said that they'll leave that to diplomatic negotiation as well. One can imagine something very like Cyprus. These republics then enter into negotiations on confederation with Ukraine. But the problem is, what about the new territories that Russia has conquered? What about Mariupol, which is part of the Donbass territory? That is now an iconic symbol of Ukrainian heroism and resistance. Very difficult for Ukraine not to demand that back.
I guess it's suppose, what does Russia want? Does it want the entire Black Sea coast?
Look, I mean, in principle, of course, Russia wants all sorts of things. But if it's taken them 6 weeks and thousands of casualties and the almost complete destruction of Mariupol to capture Mariupol, which, by the way, they haven't captured completely yet. Mariupol's a city of about 500,000 people. You're looking at having to do the same with Mykolaiv. You're having to do the same with Odessa, which has more than twice the population. It seems to me highly questionable whether Russia can actually bear that level of casualties, or indeed that occupying a pile of ruins will bring Russia much, because remember, this isn't like Grozny, which Russians never, it was obviously formally part of the Russian Federation, but nobody seriously regarded it as a core Russian city. Odessa is a place of immense meaning in Russian culture for various reasons. There was a sort of film I saw when I was last in Russia about scenes from Odessa life, very popular in Russia. If they smash Odessa to pieces and kill thousands of its people while capturing it, I don't know, but sooner or later it seems that will cause a backlash in Russia.
Here's a 2019 piece in Foreign Policy magazine, so this is 3 years ago. Alexander Motil wrote it. He is a political scientist at Rutgers University, Newark. He is an expert on this part of the world. The title is "It's Time for Ukraine to Let the Donbass Go." Again, this was written in 2019. He said the Donbass has consistently supported Ukraine's most retrograde, anti-reformist, anti-European, pro-Russian, and pro-Soviet political forces. He says it was the Donbass that made Viktor Yanukovych, whose political career was dedicated to bringing Ukraine back into Russia's orbit, president in 2010. He goes on to say Russian President Vladimir Putin's occupation of the eastern Donbass in summer 2014 effectively disenfranchised its voters, which was bad for those voters but good for the rest of Ukraine because it allowed it to move closer to the west. And I'll share with you one last observation from this article. If the eastern Donbass is brought back into Ukraine's fold, many of these positive changes could be reversed or stalled. Do you agree with this, and is this relevant anymore to what's happening now that war has started?
I agree absolutely with that. And indeed, until 2014, this was something that a good many Ukrainians said to me. Interestingly enough, especially the really strong Ukrainian ethnic nationalists who want Ukraine to be a much more homogeneous, much more Ukrainian state, which it would be if it could get rid of the Donbass. It also became clear after 2014 that Russia would never allow Ukraine to reconquer it. By the way, what Professor Motil says of the Donbass is even more true of Crimea. But unfortunately, of course, one sees this so often. Once these places become symbolic, once people start talking about the sacred soil of Ukraine or indeed anywhere else, look, it would be far better for Russia to get rid of the Northeast Caucasus, for example. There are Americans who say that it would be better for America to get rid of New York, though I think they probably mean that as a joke.
I was born in Queens, and just because
I'm so sorry, Martin.
Just because I'm a Mets fan and a Jets fan, I won't hold that against you.
I apologize, but you get my point.
Yes.
That now the emotions run so high that this is not, well, the reality can come about. The reality will come about because Ukraine can't recover these territories. But
well, the symbolism point is important because Anne Applebaum, in her latest article for The Atlantic, emphasized the democracy versus autocracy debate. The West has to defend all democracies. Her point of view, at least as far as I'm concerned, simply ignores historical specificity and the regional aspects to these disputes. What's going on in Ukraine is, of course, terrible for Ukrainians, but the West, to use that term again, can't view Kyiv like it would London. You know what I mean?
Yeah, well, absolutely. And in fact, we've proved and shown and said and demonstrated again and again that there are actually no circumstances in which we will go to war for Ukraine. We just have not been able to summon up the moral courage to draw the logical conclusions of this. Zelensky has finally done so, but we didn't. And yes, I mean, when it comes to these territorial issues, Greece and Turkey are both, formally speaking, democracies, but even when Turkey was more of a democracy than it is under Erdogan, they were not about to agree on the issue of Northern Cyprus. India and Pakistan are both democracies of sorts, but of course they certainly cannot agree on Kashmir. Nationalism is also a very powerful force that cuts across issues of democracy and authoritarianism. And also, let's be honest, I spent 7 years living in the Middle East and before that worked for years in South Asia. America is not, has not been, and never will be consistent in its support for democracy around the world. It can't be if you feel you have to play a leading role in an area like the Middle East.
Wait a second, are you saying that Saudi Arabia is not a liberal democratic society?
Who would say that? I mean, who could be so unkind as to say that?
But about this autocracy versus democracy framing that we're seeing a lot of now, I think it's dangerous because it not only ignores the regional aspects of what's going on, but it can pull you into a conflict that is not in your vital national security interests. Just to cite Miss Applebaum again, she basically says in her latest piece in The Atlantic, and I encourage everyone listening to go read it for themselves, that the United States is basically already at war with Russia, Belarus, North Korea, Venezuela, Iran, Nicaragua, Hungary.
Anne has never been a war correspondent. I have been a war correspondent. If you have experienced wars, particularly some especially nasty wars, like Afghanistan in the 80s and the Chechen War of the mid-90s, you understand very well indeed the difference between a Cold War, which is what we have with Russia and North Korea certainly, and even Iran, and a hot war. And the difference is, in a hot war, your citizens get killed and maimed. And, of course, if you're in a hot war with a nuclear-armed power, you risk that escalating basically into the destruction of the world. That is why, despite all the moral imperatives and the emotional desire to liberate Eastern Europe from the Soviet Union during the Cold War, a succession of US presidents, both Democrat and Republican, rejected the idea of rollback, rejected military intervention in the Eastern Bloc in order to support democratic revolutions because the risk of nuclear annihilation was simply too high. The other thing you have to remember is, if, God forbid, such a war with Russia did occur, and if it did escalate, possibly by accident, into nuclear exchanges, the very first place to be devastated would be Ukraine. It's very easy to listen to public spokesmen and propagandists and soldiers and so forth. But if you talk to ordinary people, very often what they really want is peace on reasonable terms. They're certainly not looking for nuclear annihilation.
In 2016, Barack Obama, in an interview with The Atlantic, to mention that publication one more time, said, "Ukraine is a core Russian interest, but not an American one." How do we square that, which I think is the correct point of view, with this imperative or this perceived need to do more to help Ukraine because it is a democracy, right? And it wants to join the West. I think there is a tension there. It's difficult to reconcile. And I'll just say one more thing before you answer, Anatol. My own supposition before the war started was that Putin and the Russian ruling circle was interested in merely the Donbass. The Minsk peace process was not going well, and that he would have been satisfied simply with that part of Ukraine. Obviously, that did not turn out to be the case. So now we have this larger war, and it starts to take on, as you said before, a larger symbolic significance that demands more, well, intervention. I just threw a lot at you there, but go ahead.
Well, I mean, on the first point, I encourage everybody to read the memoir of the present head of the CIA, William Burns, of course, written before he was head of the CIA and under Trump. But, he was ambassador to Moscow, and then he was on the policy planning staff in the 90s. And he's obviously got permission to cite memo after memo from him to Washington, warning against proposing NATO membership for Ukraine on precisely those grounds, that going all the way back to the Yeltsin administration in the 90s and Russian intellectuals not linked to the regimes, Russians have drawn that as an absolute red line. And for the West to cross it, they've been saying it to me for more than 25 years, would lead to confrontation and very likely war. And so he advised against it. Why he was not able to get the Biden administration to offer neutrality, since he clearly did not believe in NATO membership, we do not know. But I mean, Obama was absolutely right. And look, I'm not equating America and Russia. Obviously, there are huge differences, and America does, in principle, often try to do the right thing. But, we all know when China tries to develop a port, not merely in Central America, but in Central Africa, there are deep flurries of concern in America, because this is America's backyard. And this is a threat to vital American interests. And by the way, in Central America, they are vital American interests. It is an entirely legitimate interest of the United States to prevent a potentially hostile military alliance from establishing itself on America's borders. I totally agree with that. But America must then have some understanding of why other countries feel the same way.
In that 2016 interview, Obama said, "The fact is Ukraine, which is a non-NATO country, is going to be vulnerable to military domination by Russia no matter what we do." Back to Russian motivations and the role of ideology here. I tended to underplay or underestimate the importance of Russian nationalism in this whole equation. You've said several times you do not believe Russia is threatening or would even try to invade other countries that used to be part of the Soviet orbit.
Not the Soviet Union, but the Soviet orbit, i.e. Poland, the Baltic states.
Yes. The Baltic states were part of the Soviet Union, although the West did not recognize their annexation by Stalin. Can we be positive about that, given these ultra-nationalist ideologues who have influenced Putin? I'm talking about Ivan Ilyin, Alexander Dugin, and others who have talked about reestablishing a greater Russia. Ian Kershaw, as you know, was on my podcast recently, and he talked about this idea of a greater Russia that might not just stop at Ukraine.
Well, I think one has to distinguish here between territories that Russians regard as part of historic Russia, and, in many cases, with large ethnic Russian minorities and with a very important place in Russian culture. Now, that means Ukraine, or at least Eastern and Central Ukraine. Western Ukraine, which is part of Poland, is rather different. It means Belarus. It could mean Northern Kazakhstan, although Russia has never raised that issue. But it doesn't apply, you see, to places which, even if they're part of the Soviet Union, if they were part of the Soviet Union, were never regarded by the Russians as truly part of Russia. That applies to the Muslim republics of Central Asia. It applies to most of the Southern Caucasus, although Armenia is a willing ally of Russia. And it applies to the Baltic states. But above all, of course, it applies to Eastern Europe. The notion that any Russian wants to invade and reincorporate Poland is quite simply ridiculous. I mean, a top Russian official once said to me, look, we tried to do that for more than 200 years, and the results were disastrous. Why on earth, we're not that stupid, for God's sake. But I think the other thing to keep in mind is that before this war, there were quite serious doubts in many circles about whether Ukraine was truly a united nation, and particularly because all the way up to 2014 there was this pretty clear split between those parts of Ukraine in the western center who favored a Western alignment and independent Ukrainian nationalism, and those areas very largely Russian speaking in the east and south of the country which favored not being part of Russia but a close and friendly relationship with Russia. Well, I think what this war has proved, it really has in many ways proved the existence of a united Ukrainian nation. It's proved that most of the Russian speakers and ethnic Russians in Ukraine not merely did not welcome the Russian invasion, but have been willing to fight against it. Russia has had to arrest Russian mayors in the areas it's occupied, ethnic Russian mayors, because they have protested against and resisted the Russian occupation. And of course, Zelensky himself, who is Jewish and native Russian speaker by origin, has become this great symbol of a united Ukrainian nation. This, of course, has been absolutely critical to Ukraine's military resistance. Now, there are, of course, much nastier Ukrainian nationalist elements as well, but they are not the Ukrainian government. This, I think, is, in the longer run, not only in the long run, today, a death blow to Russian hopes of incorporating the whole of Ukraine in a Russian sphere of influence.
And as a practical matter, Russia's military performance so far, we should not get ahead of ourselves here, but so far has been a fiasco. How in the world would Russia be able to bite off parts of other countries? Doesn't mean they might not try, although I tend to agree with you that it's unlikely. Last question, Anatol Lieven. One wild card or variable here is what is going on in the mind of Vladimir Putin and his ruling clique. Whether this war, if it continues in a bad way for Russia, speaking about their war aims, it's already a catastrophe in a human sense. But if it continues to go poorly for Russia, whether it could destabilize his regime, we could see the end of Putin's rule and something new. What are your thoughts on that? With the caveat, only fools try to predict the future.
Yeah. Well, one thing that has become very obvious is the degree to which Putin has become cut off from wider sources of information and advice. His personal coterie has narrowed to a tiny group of people who obviously all agree with him. Now, on the other hand, and in the wider Russian elites, there are, especially the economic elites, but even among intellectuals who support the regime in principle, there are clear signs of deep unhappiness. But on the other hand, two things need to be mentioned. The first is that, of course, the regime now has an iron grip on all the sources of public information and has been able to really whip up Russian nationalism. So far, Putin's popularity, the popularity of the government have gone up very significantly.
Wow.
Since the war began. I know, very, very depressing. And of course, another reason for this, which does to some extent counteract the unhappiness with the war and the feeling that Putin made the most dreadful mistake, is the fact that there is now in Russia quite a backlash against what is felt to be Russophobia in the West. All these moves to cancel performances of Russian music. You wouldn't believe the amount of play that has been made out of the cancellation of the Russian Paralympic team, for example. And of course, the fact that now elite Russians who used to travel abroad the whole time can't do so anyway to the West. So there's this kind of embattled camp mentality is growing. But all the same, I do think that as the economic costs grow and grow, and as the casualties grow and grow, especially among the conscript soldiers, that sooner or later this is bound to lead to increased discontent.
One more question, I lied. Ideas can be hard to defeat, and there is this notion or idea that beyond Putin and the individuals running the country, that Russia needs a strong state that clamps down on a truly market economy, clamps down on civil liberties, dominates its neighbors, or in this case, its neighbor, Ukraine, because of the failures of the 1990s and the collapse of state power. That was seen then and is still seen today as having been a result of Western reforms, however poorly they were executed.
Yes, I mean, I was there as a British journalist in Russia in the 1990s, and I think there's a great deal of truth in this. It is a profound tragedy. On the one hand, democratization and market reforms went so horribly badly wrong, led to this, explosion of corruption, breakdown of law and order, violence, utter cynicism in politics and public life. And as a result, you got support for a strong man who did pull the state back together again and restored basic state services, pensions, pay, prevented secession and the breakup of the country. But of course, as happens to autocrats, especially as they get older, got more and more autocratic, more and more brutal, more and more self-satisfied and immune to outside influence, and eventually leads his country to disaster. There is perhaps a particularly Russian tragedy in this because, many of the Russian liberals were also, like I have to say, the liberals under the empire, whose activity led to the Bolshevik Revolution. Many of the liberals in Russia were absurdly utopian and irresponsible. So you have that on the part of the liberal intelligentsia, and on the part of the regime you have brutality, corruption, indifference to human life, and sheer incompetence, of course. So it is, it's a tragic outcome, one that, it must be said, we've seen in many other countries in history.
And Anatol Lieven, when the history of this period is written, historians will weigh the choices leaders such as Putin faced when he had the opportunity to steer his nation one way or the other. He chose war and conquest, a miscalculation of epic proportions. On the next episode of History as It Happens, Obama and Russia.
We recognize the deep and complex history between Russia and Ukraine, but we cannot stand by when the sovereignty and territorial integrity of a nation is flagrantly violated. If that happens without consequence in Ukraine, it could happen to any nation gathered here today.
After Russia annexed Crimea in 2014, Barack Obama chose sanctions, arguing the U.S. could never defend Ukraine against Russian militarism. Did he make the right choice? That's next when we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.